This happened last winter, and the memory still feels like a physical ache behind my ribs. I've gone over it 1,000 times, trying to find the logical explanation, but there isn't one. I still check the news every few months, hoping to find a belated report about some catastrophic grid failure, anything to prove I wasn't just losing my mind. It was a Tuesday. A storm had been blowing in all day, the kind of bitter, wet cold that seeps right into the marrow. I was alone in the house. My wife, Sarah, was working a late shift at the hospital, and I was up in the attic trying to finally sort through boxes of old tax documents and photo albums. The house is an old Victorian in a quiet, wooded part of the state. It makes noises, sure, but they're usually familiar ones. The sigh of the old pipes, the creak of the porch swing when the wind hits it just right. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the sirens start. They weren't the close, urgent sound of an ambulance, but a distant, continuous wail, like a collective moan from the highway, maybe a mile or two away. I remember pausing, holding a dusty shoebox, and thinking that was strange. I went to the small attic window and pressed my face to the cold glass. Down below, the streetlights were on, casting that sickly orange glow on the rain-slicked pavement. Everything looked normal, just dark and wet. I went back to the boxes. 5 minutes later, the wail of the sirens cut out all at once. The silence that followed was immediate, thick and heavy. Then, the lights in the attic flickered. Not a quick little stutter, but a deep, slow pulse before settling back to a weak, sickly yellow. I knew. Power failures are common out here. I grabbed my phone and started heading down the narrow attic stairs. I was maybe halfway to the second-floor landing when it happened. It wasn't a sudden pop or surge. It was just an absolute cessation. The light in the hallway vanished. The comforting hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faintest sound of the furnace fan, all of it just stopped. The house plunged into a darkness that wasn't just the absence of light, but felt like a smothering, physical weight. I had to stop and grip the banister, waiting for my eyes to adjust, because I was suddenly blind. I pulled out my phone and used the screen light to guide me to the kitchen drawer where we keep the emergency candles and flashlights. As I was rooting through the drawer, my hands brushing against spatulas and bottle openers, I heard it. A sound. Faint, but distinct. It came from upstairs. A floorboard creaking. Slowly, like someone testing their weight. My first thought was Sarah. Maybe she got off work early and came home without telling me. But the front door hadn't opened. I would have heard the heavy deadbolt slide. My heartbeat immediately picked up, a sudden, frantic drum against my ribs. I froze, one hand buried in the utensil drawer, the other clutching my useless phone. The silence was back, absolute save for the sudden, loud rushing of blood in my own ears. I finally found the heavy-duty metal flashlight. I clicked it on. The beam was a solid, bright white cutting through the black air. I held my breath and aimed it up the staircase. I stood at the base of the stairs, the flashlight beam a trembling spear in the dense darkness. My throat felt like sandpaper. It was probably nothing. A gust of wind, the house settling. But the floorboard creak had been too deliberate, too slow, and it was certainly not a sound I associated with the house alone. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. It sounded thin and reedy, swallowed instantly by the black air. The echo was wrong too. It died immediately, as if the walls had absorbed the sound. I waited. Nothing. Just the frantic, almost painful thump of my heart now. I tried to regulate my breathing, taking slow, deep inhales, but each exhale sounded loud and wet in the total silence. I decided I had to check. If someone was in the house, a burglar, or maybe a neighbor checking on us, I needed to know. I started up the stairs, taking each step carefully, the old wood groaning softly under my weight, the only sounds now mine. When I reached the second-floor landing, I swept the light across the hallway. Empty. I checked the bathroom, the guest room, and the storage closet. All clear. I was starting to relax, telling myself it had to have been the wind, maybe a loose branch hitting the roof, when I realized the flashlight beam felt heavy, almost viscous, in the air. The temperature seemed to have dropped significantly in this hallway. I could actually see my breath, a faint puff in the light. I moved toward our bedroom door. I reached for the handle, pausing just before I touched the cold brass. That's when I heard it again. Not a creak this time, It was a slow, wet scrape sound, like heavy cloth dragging across dry wood, and it was coming from inside our room. My blood turned to ice. My mind instantly raced through scenarios. Sarah isn't due home for hours. The doors are locked. The windows are sealed against the storm. I pressed my ear against the wood, barely daring to breathe. The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, I heard something else, something worse. A sound like quiet, measured breathing. But it wasn't the shallow, rhythmic inhale and exhale of someone sleeping. It was deep, wet, and ragged, like a heavy sleeper struggling for air, and it was right on the other side of the door. My hand was shaking so badly, I almost dropped the flashlight. I backed away from the door, my eyes fixed on the sliver of space beneath it. Nothing. No shadow. No light. Just absolute, impenetrable darkness. My logical mind screamed, "Run! Get out of the house! Call the police!" But a terrifying, primal curiosity, or maybe just shock, kept me rooted there. I raised my free hand and very slowly, very carefully, turned the brass knob. It made a tiny, metallic click. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was the most agonizing moment of my life. I could feel the tension in the air, a physical pressure against my skin. I flicked the flashlight beam to the floor, ready to swing the door open. But as I did, I noticed something that wasn't there when I arrived. Right in the center of the dark hardwood floor, where the light hit it, was a damp, dark stain. It was the shape of a footprint, impossibly large, and heading directly toward the bedroom door. And then the light, the only anchor I had in the suffocating black, began to flicker. My breath hitched. The flashlight beam pulsed erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and warped the hallway around me. Each flicker made the footprint disappear and reappear, mocking my sanity. The dampness on the floor seemed to spread, a slow, dark bloom against the polished wood. My heart wasn't just thumping now. It was a frantic hummingbird trapped in my chest, a desperate flutter against my ribs. I stared at the footprint. It was too big to be mine, too wide. And the wetness of it, what was it? Rain? No, the roof was sealed. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. But every thought dissolved into a cold dread. The faint breathing started again, from inside the bedroom. This time, it was closer to the door, and accompanied by a low, guttural rumble like a growl that was trying to be suppressed. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door shut, to run, to escape this suffocating horror. But something held me there. A terrifying fascination, a need to know what was on the other side. My hand, still on the doorknob, felt like it was fused to the brass. I pushed the door open, slowly, agonizingly, inch by agonizing inch. The darkness inside the room was even deeper than the hallway, a void that seemed to suck in the struggling light from my flashlight. The air was frigid, carrying a faint, cloying scent. Something metallic and earthy, like old pennies in wet soil. My flashlight flickered one last, desperate time before dying completely. Total, absolute darkness. I gasped, a strangled sound that tore from my throat. My eyes were useless. I couldn't see anything, but the other senses took over. The cold was unbearable now, like standing in an open freezer. The metallic, earthy smell was stronger, and the breathing, it was right in front of me. I could feel the hot, wet exhalations on my face. A low, wet chuckle, deep and resonant, vibrated through the floorboards and up through my feet. It was closer than I could have imagined, less than an arm's length away. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. My mind went utterly blank with terror. All I could feel was the warm, wet breath on my skin, and the overwhelming, undeniable sense of a massive, unseen presence towering over me in the absolute dark. It smelled ancient and hungry. Then a whisper, so soft, so close, it felt like it was inside my head. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a series of slow, wet clicks and hisses, like a snake struggling to speak. It ended with a sound that was unmistakably my name. The voice was distorted, guttural, yet unmistakably familiar. It was my own voice, but stretched and warped into something monstrous. I dropped the dead flashlight with a clatter that was deafening in the silence. I stumbled backward, my hands flailing in the dark, desperate to find the doorframe, anything to guide me. I fell over something soft and lumpy, the laundry hamper probably, and scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. I bolted blindly, down the hall, tripping on the stairs in my haste, tumbling down the remaining steps with a sickening thud. I barely registered the pain. All I knew was a desperate, primal need to get out. I fumbled with the deadbolt on the front door, my fingers numb and clumsy. The lock finally clicked open with a shuddering groan. I threw the door open and burst out into the storm, not caring about the rain or the cold, just needing to be free of that house. I ran until my lungs burned, until I collapsed on the neighbor's porch, shaking uncontrollably, gasping for air. The next morning, when the power finally came back on and the sun was shining, I went back with a police escort. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, no footprints, no strange smells. Sarah still thinks I had a vivid nightmare brought on by stress and the power outage. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind howls just right, I still hear that low, wet chuckle. And I swear, I can still feel a phantom breath on my face. I swear on everything I hold dear, this is true. Every hair-raising, gut-wrenching moment of it. It happened last summer, during one of those oppressive heat waves that makes the air feel thick and heavy, like a wet blanket. I'd gone to my grandmother's old house to clean it out after she passed. It's a small place, tucked away on a dead-end street, surrounded by overgrown woods. The kind of place where you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I was dreading it, honestly. Not just the memories, but the sheer amount of junk she'd accumulated. I spent 3 days sifting through dusty furniture and boxes of sentimental odds and ends. The third evening, I was finally getting somewhere, down in the musty old basement. It was a cramped space, perpetually damp, with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a weak, yellow glow on everything. The air down there was thick with the smell of mildew and old paper. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn box of old photographs, trying to pry open the lid. When the lights flickered, it wasn't just the basement bulb. I saw the faint glow from the upstairs windows through the small basement window go out and then come back on just as quickly. The old house groaned around me, a familiar sound, but it felt different tonight, almost anticipatory. I sighed, wiping sweat from my brow. Power fluctuations were common in this old neighborhood, especially during a heat wave when everyone was blasting their AC. I figured it was just the grid struggling. I went back to the box, finally got it open, and started thumbing through faded photos of people I barely recognized. Maybe 10 minutes later, it happened. Not a flicker, not a dimming, just a switch. 1 second, the bare bulb above me was glowing. The refrigerator upstairs was humming, and the faint whir of the window unit in the living room was audible. The next second, it was all gone. The darkness wasn't gradual. It was instant, absolute, and suffocating. It felt like someone had thrown a heavy velvet curtain over my head. My eyes, accustomed to the weak light, were completely useless. I fumbled in the dark, my hand instinctively reaching for the pull chain of the now dead light bulb, as if that would bring it back. A low, drawn-out groan echoed through the house then, not from the wood, but something deeper, something that felt like it resonated in my bones. It sounded like a heavy sigh, exhaled right into the sudden void of sound. My heart immediately gave a hard, painful jolt against my ribs. It was probably just the house cooling down in the sudden absence of electricity, I told myself, trying to rationalize the sudden chill that had prickled my skin. But the rational explanation felt thin, flimsy, against the sheer weight of the darkness and the unnerving groan. I pulled out my phone, the screen a sudden, blinding rectangle of light in the overwhelming black. I needed to get upstairs, get a flashlight. The thought of being trapped in that moldy basement in total darkness made my stomach clench. As I started to feel my way toward the basement stairs, my hand brushing against cold, damp stone, I heard it again, a distinct, rhythmic scratching sound. It wasn't coming from upstairs or from the walls around me. It was coming from inside the box of photographs I had just opened. My blood ran cold. The scratch was faint, like fingernails dragging across cardboard, but unmistakable. It was coming from the box right next to my left foot. I lifted my phone, its narrow beam shaking, and pointed it down at the box. It was just an ordinary cardboard storage box, dusty, full of old black and white images. But the scratching was definitely coming from within. It sounded like something trying to claw its way out of the layers of paper and photographs. My breathing turned shallow and fast, sucking air in through my clenched teeth. I took a hesitant step back, my spine pressed against the cold, damp stone of the basement wall. I tried to speak, to call out, but my throat was tight with sudden, intense fear. Only a small, whimpering sound escaped. "It's a rat," I told myself desperately. "It has to be a rat. A big one, trapped in the box." But the sound didn't move like a scrambling animal. It was too regular, too intentional. And the scratch was too precise, like it was focused on one small spot. I watched the box, mesmerized by the horror of it. I kept the phone light fixed on the lid. The scratching continued for maybe 5 seconds more, then stopped. Silence crashed back down, heavier than before. I stood there, utterly paralyzed, waiting for movement, waiting for noise. My eyes were wide, trying to pierce the gloom beyond the phone's circle of light. The sheer darkness felt hostile, surrounding me, pressing in. Just when I thought I could breathe again, a new sound replaced the scratching. A sound like paper slowly, deliberately tearing. It was inside the box. A slow, ripping sound, like heavy stock being pulled apart. I didn't think. I reacted. With a loud, ragged cry, I kicked out hard with my foot, connecting solidly with the cardboard box. The box flew across the concrete floor, crashing loudly against a stack of storage bins on the far wall. The impact was violent, and the sound of the contents, old photos, letters, and who knows what else, scattering was loud and chaotic. Then, silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't empty. It felt like it was listening. I scrambled up the stairs backward, never taking my eyes off the dark corner where the box had landed. My hands gripped the wooden railing so tightly, my knuckles were white and aching. I didn't care about the steps or the darkness. I only cared about getting out of that basement. I burst out onto the main floor. The house upstairs was an echoing tomb, the darkness broken only by the thin, frantic beam of my phone. I reached the kitchen and grabbed the heavy-duty camping flashlight from the junk drawer, clicking it on. The powerful beam felt like a weapon, cutting through the shadows. I tried to catch my breath, leaning heavily against the kitchen counter, sweat dripping down my face despite the cooler indoor air. I was safe. I was upstairs. It was just a trapped rat. Or maybe the woods settling, I repeated, forcing my logic to hold up against the panic. That's when I heard the third and worst sound. It was a whisper, faint, dry, like crumbling leaves. It came from the dining room, just off the kitchen. "Where did you put them?" It was a woman's voice, my grandmother's voice, and it was followed by the softest sound of bare feet shuffling across the old wooden floor. I froze, the flashlight beam locking onto the entryway to the dining room. My grandmother had been gone for 6 months. The doctor said she died peacefully in her sleep. But that voice, dry and frail, was hers. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking on the last word. I raised the heavy flashlight like a club. The shuffling stopped. The darkness in the dining room seemed to deepen, becoming an impenetrable curtain. I could see the outlines of the heavy oak furniture, but everything beyond was shadow and void. The silence stretched thin, punctuated only by my ragged, desperate attempts to breathe. Then, from the darkness, a noise I knew intimately. It was the sound of a very old, heavy, wooden chair being slowly scraped back from the dining table. I backed away toward the living room, my eyes fixed on the dining room entrance. My mind was screaming run, but my legs were heavy, rooted to the spot by pure dread. The whisper came again, closer this time, just on the edge of the light. "I can't find them. You took them." The scraping continued. Another chair, then another, until I heard 4 distinct grinding noises, one after the other. It sounded like the entire dining set was being moved. It suggested not one presence, but a gathering. I started shaking uncontrollably, realizing I was trapped. The front door was behind me, across the living room, and I had to walk past the open dining room to get to it. I took a blind, desperate step back. My foot kicked something on the floor. I shone the light down. It was one of the photographs, a black and white picture of a group of solemn-faced people gathered around a casket. My grandmother was in the front row, looking strangely young and alert. As the light hit the photo, the whispering intensified. turning into a sound like many voices sighing at once, a collective, despairing exhalation. I turned and ran. I didn't bother opening the front door. I yanked the deadbolt, threw the heavy wooden door inward, and sprinted out onto the porch. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block, where a neighbor's porch light was still on, humming with the restored electricity. I never went back to the house. I called the estate lawyer the next day and told him to hire movers to clear out the rest. I just needed the keys gone. A week later, the lawyer called me. He said the movers found something odd in the basement. They found the open photo box, yes, but inside, they found a single stack of pictures that had been meticulously, neatly shredded into fine strips, as if someone with incredibly long fingernails had systematically torn them apart. The lawyer assured me there were no animals down there. And here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, the part that doesn't make sense. When the movers were clearing out the dining room, they found the 4 heavy chairs had been carefully, deliberately pulled out from the table, not randomly scattered, but angled perfectly, as if 4 people had just been seated. They said the power company confirmed a city-wide grid failure that night. It was an ordinary blackout. But sometimes, when I look at the one remaining photo I kept, the one of my grandmother at the casket, I see something I never noticed before. In the deepest shadow behind the mourners, a pair of eyes, bright and utterly devoid of light, is looking directly at the camera. And I can almost hear that slow, wet, tearing sound again, like someone is still looking for their missing pieces in the dark. I don't talk about this much, even now. Most people would just call it a bad night, or maybe a psychotic break due to lack of sleep. But I know what I saw, or rather, what I couldn't see, and it changed the way I view the dark forever. It was the sudden, oppressive silence that started everything, and that's what I can never reconcile. It was late spring, and I was pulling an all-nighter for a massive project deadline. I live in a tiny apartment on the 14th floor of a high-rise downtown. Usually, the city is a constant, low-frequency hum. Traffic, sirens, the air conditioning units on the roof, the murmur of the neighbors through the thin walls. It's never truly quiet. I was sitting at my desk, staring at the monitor around 2 a.m, when the sound vanished. It wasn't a slow fade. It was an instant cut. The faint, high-pitched whine of my laptop charger, the gentle vibration of the mini fridge, the distant wail of a police siren 5 blocks away. All gone. I remember thinking, that's weird. I checked my phone. No notifications, no reason for the absolute silence. The apartment was bright, harshly lit by the overhead kitchen light, but the outside world seemed to have paused. I went to the window and looked down. The traffic lights were still cycling, but the flow of cars had thinned dramatically, and the noise from the street below was non-existent, as if the entire city had been muted. I turned back to my desk, and that's when the lights went out. Again, it was instant. The monitor screen snapped to black. The harsh kitchen light disappeared. Total darkness, save for the weak, dying glow of the street lights visible through my window. The emergency lights in the hallway outside my apartment were also dead, which was highly unusual for this building. I grabbed my phone, fumbling for the flashlight app. The small beam felt completely inadequate, swallowed by the massive blackness of the apartment. My heart started its nervous, quickening rhythm. I was used to blackouts, but this one felt deeper, colder somehow. I walked toward the kitchen, my slippers dragging softly on the hardwood. I needed water. As I crossed the living room, I heard a sound from the hallway. It was slight, almost imperceptible. A single distinct click. It was the sound of my front door being unlocked. I froze mid-step, the phone light shaking wildly. The click was followed by a soft, metallic thud. The heavy chain lock just dropped. My breath caught in my throat. I know I locked the door. I always triple-check. I stared down the hall, aiming the light toward the dark wood of the door. I could see the faintest crack of light where the door met the frame, but the sliver didn't move. Then I heard another sound, right by the door. A slow, deliberate inhale, deep, wet, like someone holding their breath for a very long time, finally taking a desperate pull of air. And it sounded like it was right inside the apartment. I couldn't move. My lungs felt paralyzed, unable to draw a proper breath. The sound of that slow, deep inhale had been so close, so unnervingly present, that it felt like an intimate violation. My heart was slamming against my ribs, a loud, frantic tattoo in the profound silence of the blackout. I tried to rationalize it. Wind pushing through the air vent, plumbing issues. But the memory of the precise, metal-on-metal sound of the locks clicking open was too fresh, too real. I slowly brought the phone higher, aiming the beam not at the door, but at the narrow entryway that led from the main hall into the living room, where I stood. The light cut across the space, illuminating the empty coat rack and the small table where I usually drop my keys. Nothing. No shadow. No movement. I strained my ears. The silence outside was still complete. No traffic. No city hum. Nothing. The building itself seemed to be holding its breath. Then I heard it again. A faint, almost silent sound of fabric brushing against the wall. Very slow, very close. It suggested movement that was gliding, not walking. I took a shaky step back, pulling the phone light down to sweep the floor in front of me. As I did, my gaze caught the polished surface of the television screen across the room. It was off, of course, but the screen was acting like a dark mirror. And in that reflection, just at the periphery of the phone's beam, I saw a shape. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too thin, a distorted column of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb the ambient light from the street, rather than reflect it. It stood just inside the main doorway, perfectly still. I slowly turned my head, agonizingly slow, trying to bring the phone light around without making any sudden moves. I focused every fiber of my being on the thing. My sweat felt icy cold on my skin. As the light beam finally swept over the area, the space was empty. Nothing. Just the familiar coat rack and the wall. But I had seen it. I knew I had. The reflection was there for a split second too long, standing exactly where the door should have been. I took one last, desperate look at the TV screen. The reflection was gone. But as I watched, a small, subtle depression appeared on the soft carpet just beside the coffee table. Then another, equally faint, a few inches away, like something heavy was moving across the floor, leaving the most delicate impressions, but without any sound. The air around me grew dense, heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I could feel the space shrinking, the oxygen growing thin. The breathing I had heard earlier, the deep, wet inhale, never repeated itself. It was as if whatever was moving through the apartment didn't need to breathe at all. I squeezed my eyes shut for a terrifying second, forcing myself to be quiet, to listen with every nerve ending. And when I opened them, the sound of the bare carpet being slowly, almost imperceptibly pressed down was directly in front of me, right at my feet. The silence was the killer. If it had shrieked, if it had lunged, I could have reacted. But this thing was utterly silent, defined only by the displacement of the air and the subtle impression it left on the fibers of the carpet. The pressing sensation was now right between my feet, and I could feel an intense, crushing cold radiating up from the floor. Panic finally shattered my control. I let out a choked cry, dropped the phone and scrambled backward. The phone skittered away, its light beams spinning wildly, illuminating the walls and ceiling in dizzying arcs of confusion. I crawled on hands and knees until my back hit the solid wood of the kitchen cabinets. I stayed low, trying to make myself small, covering my head with my arms, hyperventilating. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run, but I didn't dare stand up, afraid of what might be towering over me in the darkness. I heard the sound again, much louder this time. Not a footstep, but a single wet squelch right where I had been standing. It was followed by the low, dry sound of something dragging slowly across the smooth, glossy surface of the counter behind me. It was moving around me. My eyes darted to the moving light of the phone, now casting strange shadows on the wall. I saw the shadow of my own terrified, huddled form. And then, slowly gliding across the same wall, I saw another shadow. It was the tall, impossibly elongated shape I had seen in the television reflection. But this time, it was moving toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. It was looking for something. I didn't move. I simply watched the silent, gliding shadow pass across the wall until it vanished into the deeper darkness of the hall. I could still hear the faint, wet sound of that unseen weight scraping against the counter behind me. The cold was overwhelming, making my teeth chatter uncontrollably. I waited until I heard the distinct, soft creak of the bedroom door hinge, a sound that shouldn't have been possible with how quietly it had been moving. Before I launched myself toward the front door, I didn't care that the locks were supposedly open. I didn't care about the darkness. I grabbed the doorknob, twisted, and threw my entire weight against the thick wood. The door swung open with a resounding thud against the hallway wall, and in that precise instant, the world slammed back on. The hallway lights flickered on, buzzing harshly. My apartment lights immediately followed, bathing the living room in blinding, white fluorescent light. The hum of the city, the whir of the fridge, the distant sirens, all crashed back into the silence. A sudden, brutal return to reality. I stood there, half in the hall, half in the apartment, panting, staring wildly into the now brightly lit living room. Nothing. The space was empty. The coffee table was untouched. No strange wet marks. My phone was lying on the floor, its light still on, showing a dozen missed calls from my friend Sarah. I went back inside slowly, my knees weak, and locked the door, sliding the deadbolt home. Everything was back to normal. But as I finally turned my back to the door, I looked at the dark wood of my entryway. And there, etched lightly into the glossy paint, just above the deadbolt, was a single, deep scratch mark. And that was it. Except, when I finally calmed down enough to check my phone for the time, I saw that the text messages from Sarah had all been sent within the span of 1 hour. She said she couldn't reach me, that my phone was going straight to voicemail, and she was worried because the whole block was completely dark for over 60 minutes. But for me, standing there, drenched in sweat and frozen stiff, it had only felt like 3 minutes. 3 minutes of absolute silence. I still don't know what happened to the missing hour, or why the city went quiet. I just know that whatever came in during the blackout moved through the dark, and when the light returned, it took something, my sense of time maybe, or maybe just the safety of the dark, with it. My therapist tells me it was just a sensory deprivation hallucination. I call it the night I went blind to reality. This happened 4 years ago when I was living in a duplex on the edge of the desert, where the nights get pitch black and the only noise is the wind and the occasional coyote. I work remotely and often keep odd hours. This was about 11 p.m. on a Thursday. I was focused on my screen, wearing noise-canceling headphones, listening to a repetitive ambient track to help me concentrate. The only light in the living room was the intense white glow of the monitor and the small digital clock on the cable box. 11:04 p.m. I remember distinctly leaning back in my chair to stretch, closing my eyes for just a moment, enjoying the deep, electronic hum in my headphones. When I opened my eyes, the screen was black. Not off, not sleeping, but the sudden cold black of a computer that has been disconnected from power. The digital clock on the cable box was also dark. I pulled off the headphones. The sudden silence was shocking. The ambient track had been loud, but now there was absolutely nothing. No hum from the refrigerator in the kitchen, no faint buzz from the wall outlets, no distant wind noise. Just a dead, heavy silence that felt like pressure on my eardrums. I got up, immediately unnerved. The blackout was complete. Not even the emergency LED on the smoke detector was flashing. I walked through the small apartment, fumbling in the utter blackness toward the kitchen drawer where I kept the good flashlight. My hands found the cold metal casing. I clicked the switch. Nothing. I shook it vigorously and clicked it again. Still nothing. Dead batteries, apparently. Panic started to prickle the edges of my rational thoughts. I hated that kind of darkness. It felt suffocating. I pulled out my phone and switched on the screen, using the low glow to navigate. As I walked back into the living room, I glanced out the window, expecting to see the neighborhood streetlights dark, but they weren't. Every single streetlight down the block was on. The neighbors' porch lights were shining. I could even see the faint, rhythmic blue flicker of a television through the window of the house across the street. The entire grid outside my building was perfectly fine. The power failure was just in my unit, and it was absolute. My heart began to pound, a heavy, anxious rhythm. I walked back toward the front door, feeling a desperate need to get outside and understand What was going on? My hand reached for the deadbolt, and that's when I heard it, a small, dry sound, like fingernails tapping softly, but quickly, on glass. It was coming from inside my bedroom, down the hall. I froze, my hand hovering just inches from the front door lock. The tapping was too quick, too deliberate to be a branch or a draft. It was the sound of someone impatiently drumming their fingers against the glass of a window pane. My bedroom window was shut. I had closed it tight before turning in for the night. My mind raced, trying to find a logical link. If the power was only out in my unit, maybe the tapping was some kind of maintenance worker? But at 11 p.m.? And why wouldn't they use the front door? My breath started coming in short, shallow puffs. I slowly, carefully, began to walk down the hallway toward the bedroom, using my phone screen as a tiny, inadequate lantern. The darkness in the hallway was total and felt oddly resistant to the weak light. As I neared the bedroom door, the tapping stopped. The subsequent silence was worse. I stood outside the door, listening intently, the sudden rush of blood in my own ears roaring louder than any city noise ever could. Then, a new sound, a slow, scraping sound, coming from the floor inside the room. It sounded like something heavy and rough being dragged across the thin carpet, and it was getting closer to the door. My terror spiked, a cold, sharp pain in my chest. I knew that whatever was in there, it wasn't supposed to be. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady myself, and pushed the door open. The light from my phone was immediately swallowed. The darkness in the bedroom felt thick, almost oily, resisting the phone's feeble glow. I swept the phone around, my hands shaking violently. The room was empty. The bed was made. The window was closed and locked. I took a step inside, trying to force myself to believe that the sounds had been purely auditory hallucinations brought on by the sudden, unnerving blackout. But as I moved, I heard the sound again, the dry, quick tapping on glass. But it wasn't coming from the window this time. It was coming from the full-length mirror leaning against the wall beside my dresser. I slowly brought the phone's light up to the mirror. The glass was clean, reflecting my own terrified, wide-eyed face, illuminated from below. And then, as I watched my own reflection, I saw movement behind my image. In the reflection of the dark room, deep in the mirrored space, I saw a shape. It was tall, indistinct, and absolutely black. It was standing directly where the door frame should be. But it wasn't the reflection of my hallway. It was just an expanse of absolute, featureless blackness. The shape raised a hand, and it slowly, deliberately, placed a long, skeletal finger against the glass of the mirror, right over my reflected shoulder. The sound was real, dry and insistent, coming from the glass surface inches away from me. My reflection stared blankly back, but the thing behind it was watching me, its reflection unnervingly clear against the void. The cold from the mirror seemed to reach out and touch me. I watched the movement in the glass, terrified and utterly transfixed. My reflection stood frozen, bathed in the harsh phone light. But behind my own image, that elongated black shape was clear. It was entirely featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just a silhouette against a background that was darker than any normal room. The tapping stopped. The silence returned, crushing and complete. The figure in the reflection didn't move, but I felt a sudden, sharp spike of understanding, like a thought that wasn't my own, had been placed directly into my mind. It was the feeling of being observed, not by a living thing, but by something that simply existed outside the bounds of my perception. I held my breath, terrified that any sound or movement I made would shatter the glass and bring whatever that thing was fully into my reality. Then, the faintest sound emerged from the apartment behind me, near the front door. Not a metallic click this time, but a dry, rattling whisper that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It was too low to make out words, but the intent felt focused entirely on me. My focus snapped away from the mirror. I couldn't be trapped between two unknowns. I spun around, sweeping the phone light rapidly across the dark hallway leading to the front door. The light revealed nothing but familiar shadows. I had to move. I needed to get out of the apartment, out of the blackout. I dropped the phone right where I stood. I couldn't risk the light attracting whatever was behind me, or worse, whatever was in the mirror. I turned and sprinted blindly down the hall toward the front door. I moved in a pure, adrenaline-fueled dash, my arms outstretched, trying to feel for the door frame in the absolute dark. I slammed into the wall near the door with a painful thud. I fumbled for the knob, twisting it wildly. I didn't care about the locks. I yanked the door open and stumbled out onto the landing. The sudden blast of bright, buzzing emergency lighting in the main hallway was blinding. The usual mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system filled my ears, loud and comforting. The apartment unit across from mine had a strip of light visible beneath the door. The world was normal. I stood in the hall, breathing so hard I felt dizzy, my hands shaking. I listened to the utter silence emanating from my own apartment door, now standing wide open. I took a slow, deep breath and forced myself back inside to grab my phone. The apartment was still in total, oppressive darkness. The moment I stepped over the threshold, the silence slammed back down, cutting out the sound of the building's humming and the light from the hall. I found the phone lying face down in the carpet. I picked it up, and the screen glowed back to life. I shone the light into the bedroom. The mirror was still there, leaning against the dresser. It was clean, polished, and empty. My own reflection stared back, looking utterly exhausted. I swept the light around the rest of the room. Nothing. I left the apartment minutes later, grabbing my keys and wallet, and went to a coffee shop where the lights were bright and the music was loud. The next morning, when I returned, the power was back on. My landlord said a blown transformer only affected my unit for about 20 minutes, which still didn't explain the light outside. But what truly disturbs me to this day is what I found in the bedroom. The large, full-length mirror, which I had clearly seen resting on the carpet, was now hanging flush against the wall, perfectly level, held by two heavy-duty hooks and wires. There was no way I could have hung it like that in the dark, and I had certainly never installed the hooks. But when I went to check the glass for fingerprints, I noticed something else entirely. Where the silhouette in the reflection had placed its finger, there was a tiny, faint, dry smudge on the glass, a smudge on the surface I was touching. It looked less like a print and more like a little bit of dust had been pressed firmly against the glass. The only problem was, when I looked closer, the smudge wasn't dust. It was the faintest impression of human skin, a singular, desiccated fingerprint that looked like it had been lifted from something very old and very dry. And it was facing inward, as if the finger had been placed there from the other side of the glass. This isn't a story about shadows and things in the dark. Not exactly. This is a story about the absence of things, and the one voice that shouldn't have been there when everything else vanished. It was a few months ago, late autumn. I live in a remote cabin upstate, about 20 miles from the nearest town. I'm one of those radio hobbyists. I listen to shortwave, police scanners, everything. My main source of company is the constant chatter of the airwaves, a reminder that the world exists beyond the trees. It was just past midnight. I was sitting at my desk, listening to a late-night talk show host drone on about conspiracy theories. The cabin was warm, lit by the weak glow of my monitor and the array of small indicator lights on my radios. The wind outside was picking up, starting to rattle the loose pane in the living room window. Then, the host's voice cut out mid-sentence. It wasn't static or a dropped signal. It was an instant, dead-stop silence. The glowing display on my main radio went dark, and the little green lights indicating power on the other devices winked out, one after another. Total power failure. The darkness that followed was heavy. Out here, with no light pollution, the woods swallow everything. My first thought was a downed line. The wind had been fierce all day. I reached for the heavy-duty oil lantern I keep by the desk and lit the wick. The flame cast deep, jumping shadows around the small room, making the familiar space look hostile and unfamiliar. My heartbeat immediately quickened. Power outages happen, but the absolute silence on the radio was the most unsettling part. Usually, my battery-powered weather radio would have kicked on, blaring warnings. It was dead silent. I checked the small battery-powered camping lantern I kept on the shelf. Dead too. Everything electric, even on backup power, seemed to have been knocked out by whatever hit the main line. I went to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped onto the small wooden porch. I looked out. The moon was obscured by thick clouds. The darkness was suffocating. I couldn't see the light from the nearest neighbor's farm. It was too far away. But the lack of any distant glow from the highway, even on the horizon, was deeply disturbing. It felt like a massive area was affected. I went back inside, trying to stay calm. I knew I had one radio that was completely self-contained and battery-independent, my old crystal radio set, which ran on purely natural energy, connected to a long wire aerial I'd strung up between two pines. It was only capable of picking up the strongest local AM signals, but it was reliable. I felt my way back to my workbench, the lantern light shaking with my hands. I put on the old headphones that connected to the crystal set. I held the tuning crystal, slowly, carefully, moving it across the coil of wire, searching for a signal. All I heard was hiss and crackle, the background noise of the universe. I kept searching, forcing myself to take slow, deep breaths to control my mounting panic. No news, no emergency broadcast, nothing. It was like the entire world's communications network had ceased to exist. Then, through the loud, white noise, I heard something. Faint, a voice, a dry, distant hiss of a woman speaking. It wasn't a broadcast. It sounded like someone talking very quietly into a microphone. The signal was weak, but definitely there, riding just above the static. I adjusted the crystal, locking onto the faint energy. The voice became slightly clearer, and it was whispering my name. The whispered sound of my name, thin and dry, was chilling. My scalp tightened, and every hair on my arms stood on end. My hands were clammy inside the heavy headphones. I hunched over the workbench, the faint light of the oil lantern barely illuminating the ancient radio set. Its simple crystal and coil now acting as a conduit to something terrifying. It wasn't just saying my name. It was repeating it, very slowly, almost like a sigh. The voice had no accent, no distinct regional quality, which made it even more alien and unsettling. I held my breath, afraid to move, focusing entirely on the faint hiss in the headphones. The whispers stopped, and the dry static returned, momentarily filling the void. My heart was hammering so hard, it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I tried to talk myself down. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric anomaly, a far-off repeater catching a faint, distant signal. But the voice had been so clear, so personal, and it was impossible for this simple, unpowered crystal, set to pick up anything other than local AM stations, all of which were dead. I carefully moved the tuning crystal again, searching for the whisper. The pressure in the headphones changed, and the whisper returned, sounding much closer this time, almost directly in my ear. The voice was no longer saying my name. It was reciting numbers, a sequence of slow, even digits. I fumbled for the notebook and pencil on the desk, my fingers stiff with cold and fear. I had to write them down. I had no idea what they meant, but the urgency in the voice, the sheer impossibility of the transmission, told me they were important. I scribbled the numbers onto the paper, the scratch of the pencil unnaturally loud in the cabin's absolute silence. The voice was cold and flat, a monotone that stripped the numbers of any emotion, yet conveyed immense gravity. I finished the sequence, about 20 digits long. As soon as I wrote the last number, the whispering stopped entirely. I pulled the headphones off and slammed them onto the table. I couldn't bear the isolation anymore. I stood up, grabbing the oil lantern, and hurried out of the room, determined to leave the cabin and walk toward the highway, until I found a working phone or a person. I made it halfway across the living room carpet when I stopped dead. I heard a new sound, distinct, from the wind or the settling of the house. It was coming from the narrow wooden shelf directly above the front door, where I kept my old, unused alarm clock. A quiet, slow ticking. My alarm clock hadn't had batteries in it for over a year, and it certainly wasn't plugged in. It was completely analog and required physical power to run. The ticking was steady, mechanical, and horrifyingly close. I raised the lantern slowly, illuminating the shelf. The old brass clock sat there, its hands still, but I could clearly see the small second hand making tiny, deliberate movements. And then I saw something else. Right below the clock, on the dusty wood of the shelf, was a small, neat pile of dark, fine powder like soot or ash, sitting exactly where the clock's shadow would fall. I stared at the clock, my chest tight and burning. The steady ticking was the loudest sound in the entire cabin, filling the space with a relentless, mechanical insistence. It was an impossibility. This clock should be silent, motionless. My focus shifted from the ticking to the small pile of dark powder beneath it. I leaned closer, lowering the lantern. The powder looked strangely heavy, a dense collection of fine black particles that smelled faintly metallic and acrid, like burnt circuitry. My mind finally snapped from panic to a frantic primal need to escape. This wasn't a power outage. This was a deliberate manipulation of the world around me. Something was forcing energy where it didn't belong, and it was doing it inside my home. I spun around and bolted for the front door. My hand was on the cold metal knob when the ticking stopped. The silence that followed was instant and absolute, the same crushing vacuum I had felt when the power first cut out. I froze, my breath catching on a painful gasp. Then, the rattling whisper from the radio returned. But this time, it wasn't through the headphones. It was right behind me, echoing faintly from the workbench where the crystal radio set sat. It was loud enough to be clearly audible over the wind outside, yet still soft and dry. The voice spoke a single, chilling phrase. "You finished the code." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stood there, my hand gripping the cold metal knob so hard my fingers ached. I could feel the presence of whatever had spoken, a vast, cold emptiness that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. I yanked the door open and scrambled out onto the porch, lantern in hand. I didn't stop to lock up. I just ran, sliding down the wet, grassy slope outside the cabin, toward the dense woods. I ran until I hit the rough asphalt of the old logging road, then kept running, glancing wildly behind me. I couldn't hear the whisper anymore, but the image of that small, silent cabin, illuminated only by the faint, flickering oil lantern, was burned into my mind. I finally collapsed near a turn in the road, exhausted and gasping. I stayed there for maybe an hour, huddled against a cold rock, waiting for dawn. The sun finally rose, weak and gray. As the light grew, the world slowly returned to normal. I heard the distant drone of an approaching power company truck. The lights in the cabin had flickered back on. I went back with a repairman. The cabin was exactly as I had left it. The radio was silent. The alarm clock was still, its second hand frozen. The dark, metallic powder beneath the clock was gone. But when I looked at the desk, the notebook was still there, open to the page where I had frantically scrawled those 24 numbers. I never figured out what they meant. I tried cross-referencing them with everything, dates, coordinates, government codes. Nothing. The only thing I ever found was a week later, when I was listening to the weather band on my working radio. The weather broadcast was interrupted by a short, sharp burst of static, followed by a voice. It was the same flat, dry, whispering voice from the Blackout, and all it said was, "The activation sequence begins at 3071. Those were the first 4 numbers of the code I wrote down. I sold the cabin shortly after, never telling anyone about the clock or the voice. I still keep the number sequence in a locked safe. I check the radio every day, terrified that I will hear the next sequence, and whatever that voice was trying to activate in the dark will finally come to life. I still avoid basements. It's a ridiculous phobia for a grown man. But ever since that night, the thought of being enclosed in darkness underground fills me with a kind of gut-wrenching dread. This didn't happen years ago. It was last month, and the memory is still so sharp, it feels like a wound. I live in a split-level house built in the 1970s. The walls are thin, and the foundation is concrete, but the whole structure tends to groan and sigh a lot, especially at night. It was around 3 a.m., and a huge summer thunderstorm had just hit. I was asleep, but the sudden, blinding flash of lightning and the immediate, deafening roll of thunder jolted me awake. My bedroom was flooded with light, then immediately plunged back into darkness. The thunder was still vibrating through the house when I realized the sound was wrong. There was no subsequent noise. The refrigerator hum was gone. The soft ticking of the electric clock on the nightstand was silent. The low, steady draw of the air conditioning unit had stopped. Total blackout. I sat up in bed, instantly wide awake. I felt for my phone on the nightstand and turned on the screen. The small light was barely enough to navigate the room. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the carpet cold under my bare feet, and started toward the hallway. The air felt oddly heavy, thick with the smell of ozone from the storm. and cold, despite the summer heat. My heartbeat was already elevated, a nervous drum against my ribs. I made it to the top of the stairs when I heard the first sound. It came from downstairs, in the finished basement area. It wasn't a creak or a loud noise. It was a very subtle displacement of the air, a faint sound, like heavy cloth moving across something smooth. I stopped instantly, clinging to the wooden banister. My breath hitched in my throat. I stood perfectly still, listening. The only noise was the distant, muffled sound of rain outside and the frantic, internal rhythm of my own pulse. I strained my ears. I aimed the phone light down the staircase, a narrow beam slicing through the black pit below. Nothing visible, just the dark brown carpet and the white walls. My mind scrambled for explanations. The house settling, the storm, but the movement felt directed, not random. It felt like something large was being dragged very slowly across the floor down there. The sound paused, and then I heard something else. Something much worse, much more definite. A distinct, audible catch of breath, like someone had been holding their breath for a very long time and was finally pulling in air, right at the bottom of the stairs. The sound of that labored inhale from the darkness below hit me like a physical blow. It was wet, ragged, and far too loud for someone attempting to breathe quietly. My knees felt weak, and I gripped the banister so tightly, I felt the rough grain of the wood bite into my palm. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin and shaking. It vanished instantly in the vast, dead silence of the blackout. I knew, deep down, that there was no logical explanation for that sound. The basement doors were always locked from the inside. The windows were small and barred. Yet, something was down there, and it was breathing. I started to back away slowly, retreating up the hallway toward the master bedroom where I could at least lock the door. I kept the phone light fixed on the area at the base of the stairs. As I moved, the strange sound began again. But this time, it wasn't just moving across the floor. It was accompanied by a low, grating scrape, like fingernails dragging across the concrete wall near the utility closet. Slowly, agonizingly, it began to ascend the stairs. I could hear the subtle disturbance of the carpet on the first step, then the second. The sound of that upward movement was painfully slow, uneven, and heavy. My heart was no longer just beating. It was convulsing, a frantic spasm of pure terror. I moved faster, stumbling backward into the bedroom. I didn't dare turn my back completely on the staircase. I reached the bedroom door and fumbled with the knob, trying to slide the lock with my trembling hand. I managed to click it shut just as the sound reached the halfway point on the staircase. I leaned against the solid wood, sweat plastering my shirt to my back. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the rush of adrenaline and nausea. When I opened my eyes, the room was still pitch black, save for the phone light in my hand. The dragging sound had stopped. The house was completely silent again. Not just quiet, but aggressively silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for the slightest noise. Nothing. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard a new sound. It wasn't the breathing or the scraping. It was a soft, wet, sucking noise, right against the wood of the door, as if someone was gently pressing their mouth against the surface. It was followed by a faint, dry whisper that seemed to slide right through the keyhole and into my ear. "Your light is fading." The voice was raspy, genderless, and impossibly close. It felt like the speaker was pressed flush against the wood. My eyes snapped to my phone screen. The battery life indicator, which had been at 78% only minutes before, was now flashing red, 5%. The battery life indicator on my phone blinked once more, 4%. The whisper had been a warning, a deliberate statement about my vulnerability. Whatever was outside that door wasn't just physical. It was draining the energy around me. I backed away from the door, stumbling until I hit the edge of the bed. I held the phone up, watching the dimming screen. The light was sputtering now, unable to hold a steady illumination against the overwhelming darkness of the room. The wet sucking noise at the door stopped. It was replaced by a soft, hesitant shifting sound, not like footsteps, but like a great weight carefully adjusting its mass right outside the bedroom. My breath was coming in desperate gasps. I knew I couldn't stay there. If the light died, I would be blind, and whatever was out there would be free to move without my awareness. I looked frantically around the room. The bedroom window was a possibility, but I was on the second floor, and the drop was too high, even if I could get the lock undone in time. I made a split-second decision. I had to get back to the kitchen, where I knew there was a heavy cast-iron skillet, my only potential weapon. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I needed a distraction. I reached out and grabbed the ceramic lamp base from the nightstand. With a grunt, I hurled it across the room toward the far wall. The lamp struck the wall with a deafening smash of ceramic and wood. In the second of noise and chaos, I lunged for the door, twisting the lock and throwing the door inward. I burst out into the hallway, screaming, sweeping the flickering phone light wildly around. The hallway was empty. The stairs leading down to the basement were still dark and silent. The shifting sound was gone. I didn't stop to question it. I ran toward the kitchen, my feet pounding on the wood floor. As I reached the kitchen counter, the phone light sputtered one last time, a final, weak flash, and died. Total, absolute darkness returned. I froze, blind and completely exposed. I stood there, listening to the agonizing silence, waiting for the return of the breathing or the shuffling. But all I heard was the sudden, faint, high-pitched whine of the refrigerator unit powering back up. The lights in the kitchen snapped on, blindingly bright. The entire house roared back to life. The air conditioner, the clock on the wall, the constant hum of the appliances. The blackout was over. I stood there, blinking, shaking, and staring at the empty hallway. I walked back toward the bedroom, my legs unsteady. The door was still open. I looked inside. The shattered lamp lay on the far wall. The room was perfectly normal, except for one thing. The heavy, solid wood of the bedroom door, where I had heard the sucking and the whispering, now had a faint, dark ring etched into the grain. It was the precise size and shape of a human mouth, and the wood inside the ring looked oddly bleached, as if something had drawn the color out of the varnish. I called the police that morning, telling them about the forced entry. They checked the basement windows, the locks, and the attic. Everything was secure. They assumed I had been having a vivid reaction to the thunderstorm and the power outage. But 2 weeks later, the power went out again, brief and sudden. And when I turned on my flashlight this time, I noticed the heavy, cast-iron skillet I kept in the kitchen was now sitting on the floor in the center of the dark living room. Moved silently during the few seconds. The lights were out, and on the handle, another faint, dark ring was etched into the metal, as if something had tried to taste its way into the house. The first thing I remember is the quiet. Not just any quiet, but the kind that makes your ears ring. A heavy, suffocating silence that swallowed the usual hum of the city. It was a Tuesday, I think, or maybe a Wednesday. The days kind of blur together when you're living through something like that. I had been up late, like always, trying to finish a report for work. My old apartment building, usually a symphony of creaks, groans, and the muffled lives of my neighbors, was eerily still. Then the lights flickered. Not a quick blink, but a slow, agonizing dance between on and off, like the building was gasping for air. My laptop battery was practically dead, so I frantically saved my work, the screen dimming with each surge. For a moment, everything went completely dark. I heard a collective sigh of frustration from down the hall, a few scattered shouts. Then, just as quickly, the power surged back, brighter than before, almost painfully so. I squinted, my eyes adjusting. My old desktop lamp, a relic from my college days, had a strange, bluish tint to its light now. I shrugged it off, probably just the old bulb acting up. I stood up to stretch, my back aching from hours hunched over the keyboard. That's when I heard it, a soft thud from the apartment above me. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet, elderly woman, lived there. She was usually in bed by 10. It was well past midnight. I figured she'd dropped something, maybe her cane. I waited, expecting to hear her shuffling around, but there was nothing. Just that oppressive quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. A few minutes later, another sound. This time, it was closer. A faint scratching like fingernails against wood, coming from my own living room. My heart gave a little flutter, a nervous cough catching in my throat. I told myself it was just the building settling, an old house full of strange noises. But this was different. This was deliberate. I slowly pushed my chair back, the plastic wheels squeaking loudly in the stillness. Every nerve in my body was on edge. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron bookend from my desk, my palms sweating around its cold surface. My breathing felt shallow, each inhale a struggle against the growing knot in my stomach. I took a hesitant step towards the living room, my eyes scanning the shadows, trying to make sense of the unsettling darkness that seemed to cling to the corners of the room. The scratching stopped the moment my foot touched the living room carpet. Total silence again. I stood motionless, listening, gripping the bookend so hard my knuckles were white. The bluish light from my office lamp barely reached this far, casting distorted shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the immediate, unmistakable feeling of being watched. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a mouse. No, that wasn't a squeak. It was a scrape. Maybe the wind? I walked to the front window and peered out through the blinds. The streetlights were on, bathing the street in a sickly yellow glow, but they seemed dimmer than usual. My neighbor's windows were dark, completely dark. Even the porch light of the house across the street was out. If the power had only flickered, why were all the other buildings completely blacked out? And why was the electricity in my apartment behaving so strangely? That's when I heard the breathing. It wasn't mine. It was ragged and slow, a wet, rattling sound, coming from the short hallway that led to my bedroom. It was too close, too present. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the awful quiet. I couldn't move. Fear had locked my muscles, turning my limbs to lead. I whispered, "Hello?" My voice sounded thin and pathetic, instantly swallowed by the darkness. The breathing paused, and then a sound that chilled me to the bone. The slow, measured creak of the floorboard just outside my bedroom door. It was the deepest creak, the one I always tried to step over because I knew exactly where it was. Someone was standing there, and they had heard me. I lifted the heavy bookend, ready to swing, but my mind was screaming, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I might see. I couldn't bring myself to look directly into the hallway. I shifted my gaze just enough to catch a reflection in the glass of a framed picture on the opposite wall. In the reflection, a shape, tall, too tall, and completely still. It was a silhouette that absorbed all the light around it, a pitch-black void against the faint, bluish glow from the office. It had no discernible features, just the outline of a person. As I stared, horrified, the streetlights outside my window suddenly went dark. The only illumination left was the fading bluish haze from my desk lamp, which was dying rapidly. In the near total darkness, the silhouette in the hallway seemed to lean forward, and I swear I heard a whisper, a dry, rasping sound, right next to my ear. It didn't speak words, just a single sharp intake of breath, like a starving person finally drawing air. Didn't scream. The fear was too profound for sound. Instead, an instinct took over, pure, desperate survival. I dropped the bookend and lunged toward the light switch, flipping it down, plunging the entire apartment into absolute, blinding darkness. I figured if I couldn't see it, maybe it couldn't see me. I pressed my back against the wall next to the doorway, trying to become part of the plaster, controlling my frantic, shallow breaths. The darkness was suffocating, thick and heavy. I could smell dust and something else, metallic like old pennies. And then I heard it move. It wasn't a stealthy move. It was slow, deliberate, heavy footfalls crossing the few feet of the living room carpet towards where I was hiding. The sound of the breathing was now inches away. I felt the faintest brush of air against my cheek, cold, clammy air that smelled of ozone and damp earth. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face, silently begging for it to stop, to leave. And then, just as suddenly as the power had returned at the beginning, the lights snapped back on, full, bright, incandescent white light. I flinched, shielding my eyes, then dropped my hands and looked around frantically. The living room was empty. My bookend was on the floor where I had dropped it. The framed picture was fine. The floorboard by the bedroom door still creaked, but nothing stood there. I ran to the window. All the street lights were on, bright as midday. The neighbor's porch light was burning. Everything was normal, except for two things. First, I had left my laptop sitting on the desk when the lights came back on. Now, it was closed, powered down, and resting neatly on the living room coffee table. I hadn't touched it. Second, On the wall, right where the silhouette had stood, written in what looked like damp soot, were 3 simple looping words. "The power is mine." I moved out the next morning. I never told anyone, not really. I convinced myself it was a complex series of electrical failures and stress-induced hallucinations, maybe a small fire in the wiring that caused the smell and the darkness. But every time I see a light flicker, every time the room goes momentarily dark, I remember that suffocating quiet and the cold air on my face. And I know, deep down, that the blackout wasn't just a power outage. It was the moment something stepped across the threshold, and for a few terrifying minutes, it decided it was time to turn the lights off. I still check the fuses every time a storm rolls in. That's the legacy of what happened. A constant, low-level paranoia that tells me nothing electrical can be trusted. It started subtly, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, in the dead of a late October night. I was living alone in this small, rented house outside of town, the kind of place with original hardwood floors and a massive, ancient oak tree leaning over the roof. I remember the wind was howling, a sound like an actual creature trying to get in. I was trying to relax, scrolling through my phone in the living room, when the power went out. Not a slow, graceful fade, but an immediate, hard snap. Total darkness. Okay, standard storm stuff. I put my phone down, stood up, and went straight for the kitchen drawer where I kept the emergency lantern. The old house was breathing around me, all creaks and groans, but it was the silence outside that got me. The wind had died the instant the power failed, replaced by a perfect, unnatural stillness. I found the lantern, a heavy metal thing with a powerful LED. I flipped the switch, and the beam cut a sharp, cold circle out of the blackness. The air felt thick, almost chewy. I started making my way back to the living room, stepping carefully over the spot near the stairs where the floor always dipped. And that's when I heard the television. It was faint, just a low, static whisper. The kind of sound you get when a channel isn't quite tuned in. But the power was out. Completely. I stood frozen in the hallway, pointing the lantern beam at the dark corner where the TV sat. The sound continued, like distant white noise that wasn't quite white noise. It had texture, like dry leaves being crushed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my pulse, which had suddenly leaped into a sprint. I told myself the residual charge in the capacitors was somehow emitting a final, dying noise. That had to be it. I took a step toward the TV, my shadow stretching huge and distorted behind me. As soon as my foot landed, the sound shifted. It stopped being static and started sounding like something else, something human. A sigh, a deep, long, miserable sigh, right from the speakers. It was loud enough now that I could feel a low vibration in the floorboards. I wanted to turn around and run, but my feet felt glued to the spot. My mouth was dry, and the metallic tang of adrenaline filled my sinuses. The air felt colder, rapidly dropping below room temperature. I focused the lantern on the screen itself. It was completely black, reflecting my own terrified face back at me in the weak light. But in the lower left corner of the screen, a tiny pinprick of red light appeared. The standby light. It should have been off. Everything should have been off. The sighing stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic sound, like a gentle knocking, not on the front door, but inside the walls, moving slowly down the length of the living room toward the kitchen. Measured, precise, and utterly terrifying. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. My grip on the lantern tightened until my hand hurt. I pressed myself against the doorframe, trying to disappear into the wood. I thought, what if it's not the house? What if it's me? Maybe I was dreaming or having some kind of episode. But the cold was real. The sound was real. The knocking stopped right at the entrance to the kitchen. Then I heard something scrape across the linoleum floor. It sounded heavy, like a piece of furniture being dragged slowly. I knew what was in the kitchen. The old pine hutch my landlord used for storage. It was solid, too heavy for me to move alone. A low, guttural whisper then came from the kitchen, too indistinct to form words, but undeniably vocal. It sounded choked, almost wet. My heartbeat felt like a runaway train trying to break out of my chest. I couldn't breathe properly. I was taking tiny, useless sips of air. The primal instinct to hide was overwhelming. I remembered the old cellar door in the pantry, tucked away beneath the stairs. It was dark, dusty, and rarely used, but it was a barrier, a second layer of defense. I backed away slowly, never taking the lantern off the kitchen doorway, where the whisper was now fading slightly. I moved like a crab, feeling the furniture with my free hand, desperately trying to keep quiet. I made it to the pantry, fumbling for the small metal latch on the floor. I pulled it up, revealing the pitch-black maw of the cellar. The air that rose up from it was even colder than the room, carrying the distinct, sterile smell of old concrete and damp earth. I slipped inside, pulling the heavy wooden latch down behind me, plunging myself into a darkness more complete than before. The lantern beam was shaking violently in my hands. I listened, my entire world reduced to the desperate pounding in my ears and the absolute silence that had just returned to the house above. I sat huddled on the stone steps, dust motes dancing in the single beam of the lantern. I could feel the vibrations of the house settling back down, but the silence felt different now, felt earned, menacing. I waited down there for what felt like hours, listening to the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the dark corners of the cellar, and trying to convince myself I was safe. After what I judged was a reasonable amount of time, maybe 30 minutes, I took a risk. I raised the heavy cellar door just enough to peek out. The hallway above was still dark, but I could see faint light coming from the living room. The power was back on. I scrambled up and out of the cellar, my body aching with cold and tension. Everything in the living room was exactly as I had left it. The TV was off, its standby light thankfully dark. The furniture was in place. The windows were shut tight against the non-existent wind. The house was humming with the normal sounds of restored electricity. I walked into the kitchen, my heart still racing but slowing now into a heavy, dull ache. The hutch was exactly where it belonged. No sign of anything being dragged. I was beginning to feel foolish, tired, and deeply embarrassed about the fear that had gripped me. I must have been exhausted. But then I saw the dust. The linoleum floor in the kitchen was old, scratched, and usually coated in a fine layer of dust, especially near the back door. But now, running from the kitchen entrance all the way to the cellar door, was a distinct, clean path. Someone, or something, had walked slowly, heavily, through the dust. The path was about the width of 2 bare feet, pressed deep enough to expose the clean, pale linoleum beneath. And there were 2 distinct, clean circles right in front of the cellar door where I had been hiding, where someone had stopped and waited. I followed the clean path back to the living room. It stopped abruptly a few inches from the television set. I traced the path backwards with my eyes, realizing the terrifying truth. When the power went out, whatever it was had been already in the house. And when I turned on the lantern, it hadn't tried to hide. It had simply turned its back on the light and walked slowly to where I was standing, waiting for me to panic and run. The next morning, the police found no sign of forced entry. Nothing amiss, not even the faint dusting on the floor remained. It rained heavily, washing away any evidence that might have existed. I moved out a week later. I never understood why only my house lost power that night, or how the TV sighed when it was completely unplugged, or why the creature, whatever it was so clean. I only know that when the power goes out, the darkness isn't empty. It's full, and sometimes the creature that lives in the dark just wants to see what you'll do when it finally gets silent enough for you to hear it breathe. I still hear it sometimes when the power goes out for a second, just a faint scrape in the dark. Most people laugh when I tell the story, but they weren't there that night. They didn't feel the house breathing. It was 3 years ago during the citywide blackout. I was living alone in a rented house on the edge of town. Old wooden floors, drafty windows, the kind of place that creaks even when no one is moving. The storm had been building all evening, and the news kept warning of outages. I remember making coffee, the smell grounding me while lightning flashed behind the curtains. Then everything went silent. The hum of the refrigerator died, the lights blinked, and the entire house seemed to exhale. At first, I sighed and reached for my phone, but the signal was gone. Outside, the rain sounded like static on a broken radio. I lit a candle from the kitchen drawer and carried it into the living room. Its flame wavered like it was nervous too. I sat down, listening to the wind, telling myself it was just a storm and a temporary power cut, but the silence felt too heavy. like something listening rather than waiting. A floorboard shifted in the hallway. One sharp groan of wood. I froze, breath tight. I told myself the house was settling, like it always did, but my pulse didn't believe it. I held the candle up, staring toward the dark corridor where the bedrooms were. Nothing. Just shadows stacked on shadows. Then a second sound, softer, like a slow footstep. My throat dried instantly. I whispered, "Hello?" Even though I regretted it the second the word left me. The candle flickered. I heard nothing reply, but I swear I could sense someone standing just out of sight, watching, waiting. I stood up slowly, trying not to make noise. My heart hit my ribs so hard, it almost echoed. All I could think was that I must not show fear, as if whatever was there could smell it. I backed toward the kitchen where the front door key hung on a hook, my eyes glued to the hallway darkness. That's when the candle went out. One tiny breath of air, and it vanished, leaving me in pure black. And I swear, in that instant, I heard breathing that was not my own. The dark swallowed me whole, thick and absolute. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. My breath came out shaky and too loud. That other breathing was slow, steady, almost calm. I tried to tell myself it was the wind slipping through the old windows, but it sounded too close, too human. I fumbled toward the counter, fingers trembling as I searched for another match. My skin prickled like something was standing right beside me. Leaning close, I could feel warmth that didn't belong in a cold, powerless house. The faintest hint of movement brushed the air near my ear, and my bones turned to ice. When I finally struck a match, its flare revealed nothing but empty space. The hallway remained still, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted just beyond sight. I lit a second candle and held it tight, trying to steady my breathing. The flame wobbled, mirroring the shake in my hand. I decided to go to my bedroom where I kept a battery-powered lantern. Each step down the corridor felt like crossing a minefield. The wooden floor muttered under me, as if warning me to stop. Shadows clung to the walls, stretching thin and tall, making the hallway feel longer than it ever had. Halfway there, I paused. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too aware. A faint whisper brushed my thoughts. Not a sound, but a sensation, like being observed from behind. I swallowed hard and kept walking, refusing to turn around because I didn't want to see what might be there. I reached the bedroom door, but hesitated before opening it. My hand hovered over the knob, my heartbeat pounding against my palm. I pushed it open slowly, and the room greeted me in dim candlelight. Everything looked normal, but unnaturally still, like someone had arranged it deliberately. I hurried to the closet where the lantern was stored. When I turned it on, the cold light spread through the room, pushing the shadows back. I finally felt like I could breathe again. But as I turned around, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. On my bed, the blanket was creased, as if someone had just been sitting there. I stood frozen, staring at the imprint, listening again. That slow, steady breathing was back, but now it sounded like it was inches away. Though the room was empty, my legs started moving before my brain caught up. I ran for the door, lantern shaking in my grip, convinced that if I stayed another second, whatever was sharing the dark with me would finally show its face. I stumbled into the hallway, lantern flickering as if it might give up at any second. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was walking underwater. Behind me, the bedroom door eased itself shut, not fast, but slow enough that I knew I wasn't imagining it. My stomach twisted. I didn't dare look back. I headed for the front door, every inch of me screaming to get outside. Blackout or not, the house groaned again, long and low, as if something deep within its walls was stirring. Halfway across the living room, the lantern dimmed. My pulse raced. I whispered for it to stay on, gripping it like a lifeline. It did, but barely, just enough to cast weak light over the shapes of furniture and window frames. I could see my own breath now. The room was suddenly too cold. I hurried forward and reached for the door handle, only to feel resistance, as though someone on the other side was holding it still. I yanked harder, my heart hammered in my ears. Then, suddenly, the resistance vanished and the door flew open. Cold air poured in, and I stepped out onto the porch, gulping it like it was the first clean breath I'd had all night. All around me, the neighborhood was dark. No streetlights, no windows lit, just a silent street and rain. For thus our moment, I just stood there, soaked, trembling, lantern flickering in my hand. I forced myself to look back into the house. It was silent, empty, Normal, almost, like nothing had happened. But the wrongness still clung to me. I didn't see anything inside. No figure, no shape. But I did notice one thing. Just past the threshold, in the faint glow of the dying lantern, lay a second candle on the floor. One I hadn't lit. The wick was burnt. I didn't pick it up. I just backed away and started walking toward the nearest neighbor's house in the dark, telling myself if I kept moving, whatever was in there couldn't follow. The power returned the next morning. When I went back to gather my things, the house looked completely ordinary. The blanket was smooth again. The hallway seemed harmless. The candles were neatly stored in the drawer where they had always been. But I never could explain the imprint on the bed, or the breathing that wasn't mine, or that burnt candle with no memory of lighting it. I moved out within a week, and ever since, whenever a blackout sweeps through and the lights flicker out, I hold my breath because for just a second I swear I hear it again. Slow, steady breathing in the dark, waiting for me to be alone. This happened 2 winters ago, and I swear I still flinch whenever the lights flicker. People think I'm exaggerating until they hear the whole thing, but even then, they usually brush it off as stress or lack of sleep. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I had just moved into a small apartment downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and after years of living with roommates, the quiet felt like freedom. The building was old, though, the kind that sighs in the middle of the night and clicks as if the walls remember things. I didn't mind at first. I liked telling myself it was character. That night, a strong storm rolled in without warning. I remember watching the news talk about unstable power lines, but I figured it wouldn't affect me. I made tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, and scrolled through my phone while the rain tapped weakly against the glass. Then the room dimmed. The lamps flickered once, twice, and before I could react, everything went out. The apartment fell silent in a way that didn't feel natural. The refrigerator hum stopped. Even the passing cars outside sounded muffled, like someone had put the entire world under a blanket. At first, I laughed it off. I used my phone flashlight to look for the candles I kept in a drawer, but when I struck the first match, I noticed something strange. My breath was louder than it should have been, not because I was panicking, because the silence around me felt too wide, too empty. I lit 3 candles and set them around the living room, trying to make a circle of light. Their flames swayed even though the windows were closed. I stood there, listening to the building settle, waiting for power to return. That's when I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, pacing from one side of the ceiling to the other. It didn't make sense. No one lived upstairs. That unit had been vacant since the last tenant moved out. The landlord mentioned it casually when I signed the lease, saying renovations were delayed. The footsteps paused, then resumed. My pulse quickened. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he'd rented it without telling me. Maybe someone had broken in. My breathing came shallow, like I didn't want whatever was up there to hear me. The candles flickered harder, and for one moment I thought I saw something move in the corner of the room, just outside the light. A shape or shadow that didn't belong. I blinked and it was gone, but my skin crawled. I told myself to stay calm, but the air felt tight, thick, charged with something unseen. I sat on the couch, pretending to be brave, but every creak, every small shift made my heart jump. I tried calling a friend, but the signal was dead. The storm was worse than I thought. Then I heard it, breathing, not mine, not above. Close, just a slow exhale from somewhere behind me in the dark. I didn't move at first. I just sat there, staring straight ahead, pretending I hadn't heard it. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was the building shifting. Maybe I imagined it. But I could feel the hairs rise on the back of my neck, and that reaction doesn't come from nothing. I forced myself to turn around slowly. The shadows behind the couch stretched long and uneven, but nothing was visibly there. Still, the air felt occupied, like someone had just stepped out of sight. I swallowed hard and stood, trying to steady my hands. I picked up the largest candle and held it like a shield, its small light trembling as much as I was. The footsteps above returned, heavier now, moving toward where I stood. I stepped back instinctively, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I listened, waiting, every muscle tense. Suddenly, the building went silent again, the way it does when someone is listening for you to react. My breathing grew uneven. and I could feel my pulse in my ears. I backed into the hallway where my bedroom was, keeping my eyes on the dark living room. I needed something stronger than candles, so I went to grab the flashlight I had stored in a drawer. My hand shook when I opened it, and I clicked it on, flooding the hallway with a pale beam. The light was reassuring, but only slightly. Shadows scattered but didn't disappear completely. I swept the beam across the living room, half expecting to catch a figure standing there. Nothing. The windows rattled weakly as the storm outside intensified. I considered leaving the apartment, going downstairs to wait with the security guard. But then the power flickered back on for a second, lights humming to life before dying again. In that brief flash, I saw something standing near the far wall. A silhouette, tall and still. My breath froze. When darkness swallowed the room again, it was gone. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. My entire body went cold. I whispered to myself that it was a trick of the light, but the reassurance didn't stick. The air felt heavier, almost watching me. I took a step back toward my bedroom door, flashlight quivering in my grip. The footsteps above began again, slow and spaced, like someone pacing with intent. I stared at the ceiling, feeling sweat form along my spine. It didn't make sense. No power upstairs, no tenant, no reason for anyone to be there. And then, just as I turned to retreat fully into my room, I heard that breathing again, this time closer, right behind me. I spun around, light shaking wildly, but there was nothing in the beam, just empty air and shifting shadows. Yet the feeling of presence was overwhelming, as if something unseen was leaning close enough for me to feel its weight. I backed into my room, closed the door, and pressed my ear to it, listening to the silence that followed, a silence that felt like waiting. I locked the door, even though I knew it wouldn't mean much if someone truly was inside. The lock clicked softly, and I leaned my forehead against the wood, trying to steady my thoughts. My breathing came fast, too loud in the small room. I turned and swept the flashlight across the corners, checking under the bed, the closet, every place I didn't want to look. Nothing. But the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt crowded. I sat on the edge of the mattress, lantern light casting faint shapes on the walls. The air was cool, but my palms were damp. I kept listening for footsteps, the breathing, anything that would tell me where it was. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. A sudden draft chilled the room. My curtains moved even though the window was shut. The lantern fluttered, shadows stretching like they were reaching toward me. I gripped the flashlight tighter until my knuckles ached. I whispered that it wasn't real, that I was tired, stressed, alone in a blackout during a storm. Then came the faintest sound, like someone shifting their weight, right on the other side of the door. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me not to make a sound. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to move. Seconds dragged, heavy and slow. Then, from somewhere near the living room, the floor creaked again, soft but purposeful. Something was inside with me. I stood moving toward the corner farthest from the door. Flashlight held out like that thin beam could defend me. I thought about calling out, demanding to know who was there, but the idea of hearing an answer terrified me more than the silence. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, vibrating weakly with a notification. The sudden noise made me jump. I grabbed it, but the screen showed only a blank notification with no sender, no message. The battery indicator flickered and then died, leaving me cut off completely. The building groaned again, deeper this time, like pressure shifting through the walls. I felt it in my bones. That presence, the breath behind me, the silhouette, the pacing, felt closer now, like it was inching nearer as the blackout dragged on. I squeezed the flashlight, trying to control my breathing. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the door, waiting. Then the doorknob moved. Just a slight turn. I stepped back until I hit the wall. The knob stilled. The silence deepened. I whispered a plea, whether for help or for whatever was there to stop. I don't know. My voice shook anyway. The lantern dimmed suddenly, shrinking the light to a small trembling glow. And in that shrinking darkness, I heard it again, breathing. Not outside the door anymore, inside the room. My legs nearly gave out. I spun the flashlight around the room in a panic, the beam jittering across the walls and furniture. Nothing moved, nothing showed itself, but that slow inhale and exhale filled the space, as if something invisible was standing inches from me. I flattened myself against the wall, trying to make myself smaller, quieter. My pulse felt like it might tear through my skin. I kept sweeping the light, praying for it to land on something I could understand, even if it was a person breaking in. At least that would be real. But the room stayed empty. The breathing didn't. It shifted, like the source was walking. No sound of footsteps, just motion in the air. A subtle change of weight. The lantern flickered weaker, shrinking the glow until most of the room was swallowed in dimness. I whispered, begging the power to come back, the storm to stop, anything. I could hardly hear myself over my heartbeat. I took a shaky step toward the window, thinking maybe I could open it and scream for help. But the handle was cold as ice, too cold for a room that had been warm earlier. When I turned, the lantern went out. I was left with only the thin beam of the flashlight, and in that moment of darkness shifting around me, I felt something brush the side of my arm, warm and unmistakably human. I stumbled away, crashed into the dresser, the flashlight clattering to the floor. Its beam rolled, spinning shadows across the ceiling. For a heartbeat, I saw a shape there, long, tall, hunched as if listening. Then the flashlight went dark. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My voice wouldn't work. I pressed my back against the wall and just waited, too terrified to move. I could hear breathing close enough that I felt it stir my hair. Then suddenly the apartment lights blazed back on. The room snapped into full color, empty, still, normal. The flashlight lay on the rug. The lantern sat unlit on the dresser. The door was shut. No footprints, no disturbed objects, nothing to prove what I felt. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner until morning, watching every shadow stretch and shrink. A week later, I asked the landlord about the empty unit above mine. He swore it hadn't been entered for months. Not by workers, not by tenants. He even gave me the keys to check if I wanted proof. Of course, I didn't go. I moved out a month later. And now, whenever there's a blackout, even for a second, I hold my breath. Because in that instant of darkness, I always feel the air shift behind me, as if something still remembers me.